Hello, this is Stephen Houghton with the 1215 Project. This is a follow-up on my videos on the Constitution in quarantine, because since I made my last video about 2 weeks ago, there have been some new developments, and so I want to discuss first of all several instances of government overreach in relation to this, and secondly, I want to discuss further, when does this all end? So on the first point, unfortunately, there's been several instances where um, local government officials have really overreacted. There was the case of the mayor of Greenville, Mississippi, who evidently had the police out ticketing people for attending a worship service in their cars in the church parking lot. Now, first of all, obviously, restrictions on freedom of religion need to meet strict scrutiny. So there has to be a compelling governmental interest, which clearly we have. Um, but the government response has to be narrowly tailored to achieve the end, and they may or may not have to use the least restrictive means. Um, and one could argue, in fact, that each church service that was inside, as long as people maintained good social distancing, would be okay, would be something that was safe enough that perhaps the government couldn't control it, especially if they weren't doing something like handing out communion. But this was totally different. They weren't inside. They were in isolated boxes. It was as if they were still in their homes from a disease spread standpoint, because they were all had their windows up. I mean, this is preposterous nonsense. And fortunately, the mayor eventually realized he'd screwed up and, appealed to the governor for clarification, which, the governor then politely told him that, this was the United States, not China. We have freedom of religion here. But it is disturbing to see that sort of thing. The second instance is one where the Raleigh Police Department shut down a demonstration against the quarantine order on the grounds that protesting was not an essential activity. Now, they would have been within their rights if they had just required everyone to maintain, a 6 foot or 8 foot separation. But instead, they shut the whole protest down. They ordered the protesters to disperse. And, if people are 6 to 8 feet apart, the rate of disease spread is going to be much lower. And I think, protesting is an important right. I mean, so is freedom of religion. These people have to be really careful about this. Just because you have power doesn't mean that you can just use it arbitrarily, in the way that you would like. So, hopefully this will all be clarified. And then there's the governor of Michigan. And now this is more sort of as applied issue. She seems to have decided that to, well, first of all, it's not just as applied. I mean, she issued an extraordinarily broad order, but it has become preposterous in the instance of she's not allowing the sale of seeds for food plants or seedlings for food plants. No, this is preposterous. I mean, the production of food is, it's like life. I mean, it's sort of the most basic part of why people have a right to earn a living, right? Because we have to eat. So, anything that attacks that is really quite strict, and I would say it's not narrowly. You can't argue that it's narrowly tailored to halt food production, even in part, because of a desire to stop the spread of disease, unless the spread of the disease is actually, if the food is the vector of the spread of disease, then that would be one thing. But that's not the case here. So the last example of government overreach that I want to discuss is the president, and I have tried to avoid talking about him because once you started, you could talk forever. But he has made a few statements recently that are clearly not true. Well, I should say that I do think his general approach in one way has been right. I do think that combating disease is a state responsibility. His health, safety, and welfare legislation is the domain of the states, which is not to excuse his failure to fire the heads of the CDC and FDA, which should have been done some weeks ago, in my judgment. But, as I say, he is principally right about the state powers issue. What he is not right about is, and seems to be ignoring his previous statements about that, is his idea that, the decisions about the economy and ending the shutdown are like his and his alone. That's not the case, for exactly that reason, because this is really a state question. And also, this sort of goes back to the situation with Michigan, where the governor is treating Detroit and rural areas as if they are the same when they're not. And, New York is not the rest of the country. Here we're having, a much more serious crisis. So, that's necessarily going to impact this. The last thing I want to discuss today is when this all comes to an end. Because I think it's important that we remember that this has been really an extraordinary thing, shutting down most of the economy and ordering everyone, sick and well alike, to stay at home. And that means that it really needs extraordinary justification. And the original justification was that if we didn't do this, then the disease would spread so quickly that the medical infrastructure would be overwhelmed. Now, that has not seemed to have happened, partly probably because we have deployed additional hospital beds. But it's been a week since the Seattle Emergency Army Field Hospital was shut down. And it had treated only 8 patients during the period when it was open. And so I'm starting to wonder, about the justification. And even here in New York City, where things are somewhat serious, there are some hospitals that have been sort of overwhelmed. The hospital ship in the harbor has 80 patients when it has a capacity of 1,000. And, the temporary field hospital that has been set up in the Javits Center with 2,000 beds is 25% occupied, and the rate of admission is falling for coronavirus patients. So, the question is, is the medical infrastructure being overwhelmed? And it doesn't seem to be. And that's the justification, right? Obviously, fighting the quarantine, fighting the plague is the main justification. But an extraordinary act like this is justified by an extraordinary situation where they were afraid that the medical infrastructure would be overwhelmed. And I'm not sure that justification completely holds anymore. Please do not take this as an indication that you should, for other than essential constitutional purposes like protesting or something, that you should, leave your homes. Obviously, you have to use your judgment, but don't be foolish. As I mentioned in my last video on English constitutional development, we are now, I have been talking about a Second Amendment video for some time. I actually have shot footage to try and assemble it. And I'm going to try and do that over the next few days. But I just thought it was important to address this because God forbid that any of the public officials I've mentioned have watched my videos and thought, oh, this is all quite all right. They can do anything they want. I wouldn't want that to happen. So anyway, I would want to clarify that if it had. So that's it. I hope you have a nice day.